and his goal is to help us understand how a number of generational and technology trends are clearly reshaping the marketplace. So please give a warm Sodexo welcome to Dan Coates.
All right, good morning. What a great facility this is. It's an honor to be here with you. I wanted to kind of start with some generational context. Sometimes if you want to understand the future, you've got to look to the past. And as a great futurist, a guy named Magnus Lundquist once told me, for as much as you want to see into the future, you should stare into the past. So if we want to look forward 10 years, we should look back 10 years in order to give that context. So let's go through some generational context. Generations has been a pursuit of study since Alexis de Tocqueville. Generational theorists are an interesting lot. I count myself amongst them. And the one thing that you can always count on is that we never agree on anything. The start years and end years of different generations is always this big debate. We can't seem to get along. But generations are this sort of, it's a little bit like the atmosphere. It's this self-healing mechanism of the human race. And generations tend to do kind of three things. Each generation seeks to redefine itself in the context of what came before it. Usually what it wants to do is three things. One, redefine based on the excesses and poor behavior of the immediately prior youth generation. Another thing that they want to do is kind of critique the man, the sort of in-charge generation. And then the last thing that they try to do is kind of take the place at the table that's left behind by the then departing generation. So if you think about it, generations kind of have this interest in finding their place at the table, and they do it with a little bit of criticism and a little bit of appreciation for what came before them. And importantly, they move history along. If we didn't change as a human race, we would become excessive and more excessive and more excessive. Think about the bad behaviors that the boomers invented and Generation X perfected. If we kept going with sex, drugs, and rock and roll indefinitely, we'd perish as a human race. And so what has to happen are these little pivots, these left turns that occur within society wherein a generation says, wait a minute, actually I want to do this differently. And they go ahead and take it in a different direction, thus narrowly averting our dropping off the cliff. So looking back at past generations, certainly if you've watched any of the Brokaw stuff, the GI generation, the greatest generation, these are folks with birth years 1901 to 1924, 89 years and older at this point. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of them left among us, but this was a great heroic generation, fought a couple of world wars, put into place a lot of the social safety net that we value today as a society, and really had this team orientation and approach. If we work together, we can solve any problems, whether it's problems at home or problems abroad. And they really did live that lifestyle day to day. They were followed by the silent generation, birth years 25 to 42. And the interesting thing about growing up, so the GI generation grew up in turbulent times. In fact, they came of age in turbulent times and really wrestled and grappled with them. They came of age during World War I and kind of fought in World War II. So they were up to the challenge. What's interesting is if you're a very small child during turbulent times, society kind of scoots you off to the sidelines for your own protection. You don't really get that chance to engage with the problems. You're sort of shielded from the problems. And so the silent generation was a generation that was more critic and artist than full participant. The silent generation is the only generation to have never had an American president, which is fascinating because we skipped straight from the GI generation over the silent generation and to the boomers. Also interestingly, the silent generation were the sort of company men that worked at IBM, and it was about, if you grow up in turbulent times, it's all about following the rules. Can't we just set a system of rules in place that will protect everybody and prevent these horrible things that happened in our distant childhood memory from ever happening again? So between the GI generation and the silent generation, we created and codified rules and regulations and rules of behavior and social mores and the real sort of the operating manual for the North American human condition, which then, if you look at the boomer generation, their archetype is prophet, P-R-O-P-H-E-T. They looked at that codified system of behavior and hated it. it was, 40 years, 50 years in the making, and so parts of it were outdated. But the boomer generation and the prophet archetype in general sets themselves to dismantling things and reshaping them in their own image. And so the boomer generation looked at things like race issues and gender equality and a number of other things and realized that that codified system was out of time, out of place, an anachronism, and set themselves to ripping it apart. Equally, where the silent generation and the GI generation were all about teamwork and working together and creating social structure, the boomer generation started a trend towards individualism. What's right for me, not what's right for us all or the best way for us all to get along, but what fulfills me and what makes me happy in my life. And so one of the interesting things that we'll talk about later is the way that they were parented versus the way that they parented. Boomers really inverted the power structure within the family unit, and that has a lot to do with how millennials grew up, but we'll get to that in a moment. The boomers were followed by Gen X. I count myself among members of Generation X. 1961 to 1981, we were the latchkey kids whose parents were getting divorced, and of course my parents were the silent generation. They lived within this codified structure that started getting ripped apart and their world changed dramatically. And so lots of midlife crisis. I remember lots of Hugh Prather books around the house, I'm okay, you're okay, or a lot of Dale Carnegie stuff. Basically, Generation X was probably the least parented generation out of the 5 that we'll speak of today. Left to their own devices. As a kid, I had a bicycle. I would ride for miles. There was no one really all that concerned about where I was precisely and when. I knew that I had some basic rules. We had a bell in the backyard of our house, and I could hear it for miles, but when my mom rang the bell, that meant it was time to come home. What I was up to prior to that moment was anybody's guess, and frankly, again, that sort of bad behaviors that the boomers sort of invented, we Xers perfected. All the Center for Disease Control and National Institute for Health, risk categories peaked during Generation X, whether it was teenage pregnancy or drug abuse or anything else that was bad for you. That all sort of ended with Generation X, and the millennials slid into view. Now the millennials, again, this pivot, this left turn, and what they really wanted to do is kind of get away from these bad behaviors, this sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the mistake that a lot of people make is they think that youth is this linear trajectory where if when I was young it was all about the drugs and the sex and the music, it's got to be the same now, but even more so. It's actually not. In fact, if you were paying attention, in the early 80s, some interesting things started to happen. The baby on board signs. All of a sudden, parenting became this real focal point. Music changed from the angry rap and punk rock to all of a sudden Hanson and Britney Spears and the bubblegum pop sort of trend. Society veered away from the edge, from the cliffside, back to the center, to the mainstream. And millennials are very conventional and traditional in a lot of the ways that they look at the world as sort of inspired by their boomer parents. So I've run down the current American generations from GIs to millennials are birth years 82 to 2004. There are a generation that follows them. They're tentatively called plurals, as they live in a very pluralistic society with lots of options and multiple screens and multiple devices. And it's interesting, we're just starting to study them now to try to understand their behaviors. And so 9-year-olds are the youngest of millennials, 8-year-olds are now the oldest of plurals. And we do a lot of tween research, and it's fascinating to see how, again, we lean heavily on the archetypes. Millennials were a hero archetype. Plurals will be another artist archetype. And we're again in another position where very turbulent times that millennials are growing up during, a couple of wars, an economic recession, eerily parallel to the world that the GI generation came of age in. And similarly, just as in World War I and World War II, we scooted the people who were young children to the sidelines during times of great turmoil. The same thing is happening right now with plurals. We're scooting them to the sidelines for their own protection, and we're developing rules and regulations for their protection. Right now, we're in from a policy point of view, we're in a time of heavy regulation. We're seeing sort of things getting ripped apart with these wars and recessions, and we're trying to layer a bunch of rules and regulations of the road to allow us to then have a little bit more stability in our lives. if that sounds a lot like what happened post-World War II, it should. These cycles of history tend to repeat themselves over and over. And what I still can't figure out as a theorist is, do the generations create the events, or do the events create the generations? And in a weird way, I kind of think that, the prophet archetype is always going to do what the prophet archetype wants to do. These sort of conflicts and battles, and whether they're the sort of the social tug of war or the moral tug of war that's going on, these kinds of things tend to open up doors that then result in the next event and the next event. So call me a fatalist, but these things are somewhat predictable, and they seem to repeat themselves over time. But back to millennials. What's fascinating about millennials is their place in time, and they're the largest generation in American history. An interesting thing happened. Boomers had children a little later, Xers had children a little earlier, and it's propelled this long sustained increase in birth rates. Birth rates are also highly correlated to economic activity. And so you see, a couple of peaks. 1990 was a pretty good year for us as a country, and so the birth rate really peaked. And 1990 is a fascinating year to study. You see this trend where we had the largest graduating high school class in American history, some 5-6 years ago, largest freshman class in U.S. college history 5 years ago, largest graduating class in American history the last 2 years. They took 4 and 5 years to get out of college. And now this sort of great arrival of the 1990 birth year into the workplace, which is, again, a fascinating trend, particularly given the recession. We've seen customers that sort of all of a sudden ring the phone off the hook. Ypulse has been around for 10 years. We've been studying this. But when that 1990 birth year turned 21, all of a sudden every alcoholic and spirits manufacturer was calling us, asking to try to figure out what was happening in their world, because it changed dramatically almost overnight. So this has shifted the landscape. A lot of the reason why understanding this generation and their technology habits is really critical is because this is the big generation that's going to slide through. And as they age up and go through different stages in their lives, you can expect similar behaviors. Their values don't change. One of the best metaphors that we use in terms of generations and then life stages, as well as demographic age categories, is that a life stage or a demographic age category, say 18 to 24, that's like a hotel room. Different generations check in and check out of that hotel room with what? Their baggage. And their baggage is largely how they were parented or raised, as well as what happened to them along the way, what events in society. For millennials, it's things like Columbine, 9/11, the Great Recession. These kinds of events have marked them, shaped their worldview, and give them the sort of lens through which they perceive things. And the next generation to follow the millennials, the plurals, they'll check into that same age category and check out again, but they'll have a completely different view of the world. Equally, fatherhood, it's a perfectly legitimate life stage, but fatherhood for a boomer is radically different than fatherhood was for an Xer, is radically different than fatherhood for a millennial. Millennials, right now there are 20 million millennials who are parents themselves, raising small children. 2.5 million millennials have children, there's 2.5 million children of millennials every year, and it's accelerating at this point. So what's fascinating is now, as they then become parents themselves, how a lot of their core values and attitudes about technology and society sort of harden and crystallize. So a massive generation, and with rich diversity. Again, the plurals are named so because this will be the first generation in America where Caucasian is not the majority race. In fact, this sort of trend line, we've often thought that millennials are sort of post-racial. They don't see the world in sort of race terms. And if they're not post-racial, then the plurals will definitely be post-racial. They just won't think of the world that way. There won't be this one dominant race that sort of monopolizes things. It'll be a combination across all of them. And so in understanding millennials, there are 7 core traits of the millennial generation. Special. This is a generation that was really valued and treasured. Boomers were the early parents of millennials. Xers were the later parents of the millennial generation. And boomers really saw parenthood and having a child as an outward expression of their sort of life's goals and achievements. They were very proud of that. We saw the baby on board signs in about 1982 showing up in cars, and this was this signal from the boomer parents of, hey, there's something very treasured, something very special in this vehicle. And so that specialness tends to rub off. Millennials perceive themselves in this sort of treasured, valued role, and so a lot of the things that we do to motivate millennials is based on this sort of VIP status, this notion that you're somehow special. And of course, it's ironic, a generation of people, all of whom are special, is kind of an oxymoron, but at the same time, anything that sort of makes them feel like they've got access or insider or advantage really plays well. Sheltered, you've heard the term helicopter parents, these parents that are hovering over top of the lives of their millennials, their treasured millennials, making sure that everything goes right, writing their essays, calling and complaining to their professors when they don't get the marks that they'd hoped for. And I'm not going to lie, 80% of our staff are millennials themselves. We negotiated the starting salary of our first millennial employee with their mother. Now, the truth of the matter is that we started having the conversation, and it seemed like it was taking a long time for her to just respond to questions we were asking. So I kind of knew enough about the generation to say, listen, if there's somebody else that we should involve in the conversation, let's get them in the room and let's actually work this through, because I'd like to get started as soon as we can. Now, in fairness to Adrienne, our first millennial hire, her mother was a labor lawyer, and so, this is probably a pretty good asset to have in your hip pocket. But at the same time, it was fascinating how, in the end, Adrienne wasn't even involved in the conversation. She was staring sweetly at her labor lawyer mother, waiting for her to decide what kinds of things were the right things to ask for and what kinds of things to insist upon versus not press too hard on. And we see that in the workplace. In our company, we have Bring Your Parents to Work Day. I'm not lying to you. Every one of our millennial employees have brought their parents to our office. No exceptions. Even the one that's from Louisiana. Their parents came to New York and visited our office, and I drop everything to sit with the parents of a millennial staff member and help them understand how we're going to take care of and nurture the career of their precious offspring. Without the support of their parents, this millennial isn't going to perform for us. If their parents think that we're some fly-by-night shady organization with, a CEO that has attention span issues, then I'm not going to be successful in convincing them to give their all to our mission, to our cause. So the rule is they go straight into the boardroom, we sit and talk to them about what skills their child has, what skills we think their child needs, and how we're going to steward a portion of their career to get them from where they are now to where we think they need to be. And the parents walk out on cloud nine feeling like they've somehow guaranteed the success for their children, and why not? I'm a father of a 14 and a 17-year-old. It's a competitive world for them. I'd love to give them every possible advantage. I unfortunately have the understanding that independent thinking is an advantage that I can give them, and so I tend to veer away from some of the poorer behaviors of the parents of millennials, and yet at the same time, it's a competitive world. If there was anything that I thought I could do for my children that would give them a leg up in a world where there's 101 million other people just like them vying for many of the same things, in a world where abundance of resource may not be the word of the day, I would do that, and so I don't blame them. So other ones, confident. This is a generation that is incredibly optimistic, feels like they're going to achieve all of their life's desires. Team-oriented. I blame Barney the dinosaur for starting this trend, but this whole notion of we're going to work together sounds eerily familiar to the GI generation, but they are very team-oriented. They feel that all problems can be solved if everybody would stop being selfish and individually minded and work together as a team to find a solution that works for everybody. So there the pendulum starts swinging away from the individual and back to, right back to the sort of social team orientation, faith in social institutions. Occupy Wall Street was a knee-jerk reaction by the millennial generation to, in their minds, a bunch of selfish individuals that demanded more than they maybe should have deserved. And so now they feel like layering a bunch of rules and regulations to prevent the individual from wreaking havoc on society is the right way to go. Conventional, when you talk to millennials about their goals and dreams, they want families. They would like to, minivans aren't the worst thing. In fact, they have fond memories of cruising around in the family minivan. They have a lot of aspirations and tastes that, aren't crazy, wild-eyed kind of boomer or Xer dreams of joining the Peace Corps and going off to Africa and changing the world. They've got some very conventional wisdom. In fact, TFA, Teach for America, and Peace Corps are both clients of ours. They're struggling right now in that, for a millennial to move away from their family, something they treasure and love, to go to another country or another part of the country even, is a real ask. Millennials, as they're making decisions in terms of college, we talk to many of them where they say, well, I'd like to be this, but there aren't many opportunities to be that where my family lives. And I'd like to be near my family. They're a big part of my life. So I'm going to change my major so that I can do something that will allow me to be closer to my family. It's fascinating. Xers, I mean, honestly, I never had my parents drive me to college. I drove myself. But if they had, I'd have insisted that they drop me off at the outskirts of town and I'd have hitchhiked the rest of the way, right? Whereas millennials, nowadays, you've seen it on campus, they have orientation sessions. The parents come and with the kids and wander around campus with the kids and learn about the academic environment with the kids. And then when it's time to part company, they give the teddy bear to the parents, and the parents then cry their eyes out as they depart the campus, leaving their precious offspring in the hands of the academic community. Pressured and achieving. This is a generation who are really quite capable. Listen, it takes a tremendous amount of coddling. I have to give a lot of context to my millennial staff members, but they outperform anybody, bar none. Their technological proficiency, off the charts, their ability to produce is amazing. It's just you have to sort of give them the context and the support to make that possible. Additionally, when it comes to pressured, they all have expectations. They're doting boomer parents and doting Xer parents have filled their heads with all of these aspirations, and the expectations are high. This is the most measured generation in American history. When you look at No Child Left Behind and all of the academic testing, they've been taking tests, aptitude tests, since birth. It's also the most photographed generation in history. When everyone has a smartphone in their back pocket, there is no such thing as picture day. Every day is picture day for these kids. So there's a lot of pressure on that front. Okay, so let's move in quickly to the why behind the what. There's three that I want to help you understand in order to not only understand what's happening now, but what's going to happen next. And the first is parenting. We talked a little bit about that. For the GI generation, for the silent generation, frankly, for all generations that preceded boomers, there was a family structure. There was an authority structure. Parents made decisions and children followed suit. I'm old enough to remember hearing a lot of the remnants of this attitude. Children should be seen but not heard. Speak when you're spoken to. There was this real structure to things, and you were supposed to be the understudy until you became an adult. And until that point, you really weren't supposed to be involved in the decisions. You weren't supposed to speak your mind. You didn't really have an opinion. Now, boomers grew up in this world, and they hated it. They vowed one thing and one thing only, that they would invert the power structure within the family, they would create a flattened organization, and that everybody would have their say, and that everybody would have an opinion, and that everybody would be asked to participate in the family unit. And so they did, creating a very flattened family structure. You would see on auto lots, the sort of boomer parents showing up to look at the minivan with their kids, and the car salesperson would look on in amazement as the parents would ask the kids, okay, well, which minivan do you guys want to buy? You're going to be spending as much time in it as we are. What amenities in the back seat do you think you would like to have in our minivan? This sort of co-purchase behavior started very early and continues to this day. Millennials are highly integrated into the decisions that are made within the family unit, within the organization. In fact, they not only were involved in it, they had a very specific role. Millennials had a specific task that they performed within their family structure, and that was CTO. And they basically had the ability to make any technology decisions. Think about this. This is the first time in the history of the human race where the youth part of our society is more advanced than the adult part of our society. Previously, when we were an agrarian society, fathers would teach sons in the field, industrial society, in the factories. Nowadays, we've got this interesting inversion where the most advanced individuals from a technology perspective in our society are the youngest members of our society. And it's created all of these interesting issues in that there's this social tension of the people that are fighting on the front lines of privacy issues, of all of the things that come part and parcel with technology, are the youngest members of our society. I'll tell you a story. It's a little bit personal, but you'll forgive me. My son was dating a girl virtually. I've never dated anyone virtually. All of my relationships in my life have been physical ones. But he was dating this girl from another town, and he and she weren't getting along, and it was time to break up. And he didn't know how long you needed to wait after a virtual relationship before you could start another relationship. And so he asked, not his father, but Father Google, and Google told him that 7 days was the appropriate amount of time to wait between his previous virtual relationship and his next relationship. And thank God he didn't ask me. I mean, I swear I wouldn't have known what to say exactly. And so all of these issues that children are facing for the very first time based on this influx of technology are being dealt with peer-to-peer. In fact, if you ask children about privacy, if you ask children about advice when it comes to technology, the first person they turn to are each other. Their peers, their friends are going to help them understand and sort things out. The second person or infrastructure that they're going to turn to are the providers of the technology themselves. They'd rather ask Facebook for advice about Facebook privacy settings than their own parents. Parents are actually number 3, educators are number 4, but the idea that they're kind of on their own in this world of technology without us. Dana Boyd, who's a fellow at Microsoft, has this fascinating theory, which is we did this. This is our fault. Children have a desire to be amongst each other on an unsupervised basis and have since the start of time. But when our society wouldn't let children play in the neighborhood park for fear of sexual predators and wouldn't let them go to the shopping mall for fear of drug dealers, kids went underground. And underground was in the basement and online. And so the rise of Facebook and the rise of social media are largely based on parents having a physical clampdown, putting their kids under house arrest, and their kids wanting to do what kids always want to do, which is hang out with each other, spend time on an unsupervised basis. They went online. And so you can almost see how our suppression of one type of behavior has resulted in another. And so when we ask kids about technology, and when we look at the different generations, the Pew Research did an interesting study. It was in 2010. They asked generations, and mind you, millennials as youth and Xers as mid-age and boomers as later middle-aged. They asked, what makes your generation unique? What's fascinating is all generations think that what's unique about them is that they're smarter than other generations. That shows up everywhere. And clothes and music you would naturally suspect to be part of the youth culture. But if you look at technology, Xers had a little bit of it, but millennials really see that as their calling card, their claim to fame, the reason why they're unique and distinct within our society. There's also this fascinating swing between liberal boomer parents to then conservative Xer parents to then liberal millennials. A large part of what we see politically is based on this gyration between generations. And then look at the boomers, this sort of culture wars of the 90s, values and ethics. These are the things that they see as being, really important. Technology was number 14 for boomers, so they certainly don't see themselves that way. And let's hear from millennials themselves about how they feel about technology in comparison to other generations. I may have to click a button over here.
I love the fact that I can go on my computer and just get anything I need in an instant. Whereas I think, even in schooling, when my dad and mom went to school, they had to write a paper. They had to go to the library. Whereas I just go on Google.
According to my parents, when they had free time, they'd go outside and play. Whereas I'd say my generation is more inside, technology.
That's the confusing part, because everyone from the generation from my parents' side or everyone from my grandparents' side don't depend on technology this much, and they ridicule me on the concept of being dependent on technology.
Like, I have a boyfriend, but we met like online, so that really wasn't around back then. They like had to go and meet people, like they met people at dances.
And we're really the first generation to grow up with technology readily available and be able to use everything in their daily lives.
So much of this generation is technology. If we have a question, we can just type it in into the internet, and we'll get like less than a snap of a finger, get thousands and thousands and millions of answers.
Thousands and thousands of millions of answers at the snap of a finger. Imagine what that does to a generation, that you would have access to all the world's information at your fingertips. It's kind of trippy, really. And what's fascinating, technology's always been around. Technology's been around since, the horse and plow was technology when you think about it. Refrigeration was technology. At one point, my grandfather or great-grandfather thought a lot about blocks of ice and straw and how he could keep things cold. And then, we've always had technology. Boomers had the internal combustion engine. That was their big thing, hacking and modifying V8 engines, creating rat rods and race cars was their sort of implementation. But what's more fascinating is what a generation does with the technology that's available reveals much about who they are and what they are all about. For instance, Xers have been around, the same sort of emergence of the web at the same time as millennials. What do Xers do with technology? Well, we create the personal computer. Personal computer is a very individualistic pursuit. I have a computer, and I'm going to be very productive on my computer, and I'm going to send you stuff from my computer to your computer. That's how an Xer thinks about this. Amazon, I'm going to create a website. I'm going to be able to buy stuff, and I'm going to be able to do that whenever I want to. You hear the use of the word I there. eBay, I'm going to buy and sell my stuff to other people who value it. Now, look at what millennials did with technology. Facebook, by a millennial, is a perfect example of what millennials think technology should be used for. Connecting with each other, staying in touch with each other, constantly. Now, I'm not saying that Xers and Boomers don't love Facebook, but it was created from the mindset of the millennial generation. I want to know what's up with everybody around me, my social graph, the people that are close to me. I want to be able to sort of stay in touch with them constantly in this team-oriented, team-minded. And also, think about this sort of, the questions that they're asked. What's on your mind? Organize and share the things you love. There's this notion of this sort of, the sort of VIP, putting them at the center of the universe. And so millennials are really at the forefront of shaping, culture. And again, if you think for a 21-year-old today, they were 5 when Google came out, access to the world's information from the age of 5. Napster came out when they were 6, so we saw the music industry deal with that. Wikipedia when they were 8, Facebook when they were 11, the App Store when they were 14. Think about what it does to people to put those kinds of tools in their hands at those ages, and how they're going to then forever expect things of you day to day. So the great example of, 25 minutes after tweeting for the first time, not getting a response, results in this, this angrygram, definitely is the way that this world works in their minds. For us, we're like, wow, 25 minutes, that's like super responsive. For our organization, anytime we're interacting with millennials, we remind ourselves how super time sensitive and focused they are. And there's almost this interesting power inversion, which is the last sort of why behind the what. Think of a world where you have access to the world's information and your teacher is trying to grade your paper. What is plagiarism in a world where Wikipedia exists? More importantly, think of the inversion where when I went to college, the professor was God. He determined my fate, and I would never have messed with a professor because I wanted to succeed, and so, I played by his rule set. A lot of times, the first week of class was all about trying to figure this guy out, figure out what his rules were, and then play to those. Nowadays, professors live in fear of their students. They know that they can, be rated openly on the web based on their teaching style, based on their demeanor, and they know that at some level, the students are in charge of their fate, not the other way around. And so what that's done is created this inversion where it used to be that brands like Sodexo made all the decisions and they thought long and hard about what people wanted, what needs there were, and then they communicated their decisions to the consumer, and the consumer either bought into it or didn't. Nowadays, that's completely flipped around. Consumers are better marketers than marketers themselves. Word of mouth is the #1 criteria upon which people make decisions. If you don't have consumers engaged in making the decisions as to how things are going to work and how things are going to be communicated to them, you're really at a disadvantage. Again, this is a world where the power is inverted, the consumer's in charge, the brands are running as fast as they can to keep up to the bus. And so this generation has the know-how and the encouragement to change everything. And you see what we call the millennialization of one industry after another. The music industry started with Napster. You can't even recognize it anymore. It's unlike what it was in the 80s or 90s. Look at the television industry. Netflix, Hulu, it is also being millennialized. It's being radically reshaped. The automobile industry. I mean, we work with a lot of car manufacturers. They create great cars. But then you look at the rise of these car sharing services, and you instantly start to realize that millennials are changing that industry as well. We did, for the first time, a study on housing, where, what's the starter home for the millennial generation? We've done retirement studies where, what's retirement going to look for millennials recently? And so, I think industry is starting to recognize that as this generation sweeps through, they've really got to start to prepare for things. Okay, now move on to millennials and mobile, and talk a little bit about how they're using this technology in a way that's really distinctive. When you think about it, when we were young, coming of age involved 3 important things. Some of us only 2. When I could drive, when I could vote, and when I could drink. This was coming of age for an Xer. And probably, you could argue a lot of us didn't care that much about voting. So then, if you then take a look at what's going on for millennials, their pathway to independence starts much, much earlier. 9 to 11-year-olds get an iPod Touch. That's sort of like a smartphone with training wheels. You don't exactly have access to everything everywhere, but as long as you're at home and on Wi-Fi, you can get all the apps, you can get all the media, you can get all the entertainment. And then, by the age of 13, most kids have a smartphone or a cell phone. Basically, you're talking about the ability to now interconnect with anybody, anywhere, anytime. And as we heard before, it's not via voice. We've done studies where we've looked at how kids use their smartphones. When it's amongst each other, they text. If it has to do with school or work, they'll email. When it has to do with their parents, they're really trying to train their parents how to text, but they'll actually break down and make a phone call. And basically, so they have this notion that if I'm interacting with different generations, I've got to switch out of my natural behavior. But if you left them to their own devices, they would text, they would use social media apps that are largely allow them to sort of keep up with each other and see where each other are at any given moment around the clock, around the day. And there's this notion where things are changing pretty dramatically. What is status in the new world? Status, actually, think about that word. Status as a word has changed. I think, from a dictionary perspective, the #1 definition of status is no longer, I can afford crap that you can't afford, and so I'm better than you. That used to be what status meant. Now status means, your current context. And so status updates. Status now means, hey, what are you up to? Where are you right now? So that I can let you know what I'm up to and where I am right now. And this hyper focus on time. I mean, Instagram, Facebook is on the outs with teens and tweens. Instagram is on the rise. Snapchat actually, I think they should have taken the $3 billion from Facebook. We're seeing lots of signs that Snapchat is starting to fade, and these visual sort of metaphors, this take a picture to express how you're feeling as opposed to type words to express how you're feeling, is really sort of becoming the norm, and Vine is just absolutely skyrocketing. When we measured it 6 months ago, it was at 4% usage. We measured again last week, Vine's at 18%. So it's radically becoming, this sort of short form video social network is becoming the new interesting environment where, young people are amongst other young people in an unsupervised environment. In fact, you kind of could have called the death of Facebook at the time when all of their parents crowded into the room. Imagine the worst thing on earth. This is a great analogy that a friend of mine gave me. The worst thing on the earth would be to be a young person, to be in a nightclub, and you see your mother show up. So that's kind of where we are with Facebook. So this sort of pathway into independence, it has a lot to do with status. It has a fair amount to do with influence. This is a generation where their currencies are likes and friends, right? Think about that. That's been what they've been chasing for a very long time now. So their ability to sort of influence the purchase behavior of others is vitally important. And the ability for others to influence them is also hugely important. And it's based on, this is a generation where standing out and being rebellious is not important to them. Doing the thing that everybody else is doing, the popularity contest, a lot of people like this, so I might like it too. So it's again that conventional flavor of finding things and defining yourself, the discover, connect, and share with others. They do love to discover new things. They like to be the one that brings a new idea into their friendship circle. But once they do, then you see this rapid embracing and adoption of it. And I could cite a number of examples from the iPod to Facebook to the Obama campaign, where millennials felt very powerful as they discovered something new and then brought it to not only their friends, but to other generations. And so you can map an entry point through the millennial generation to other generations of technologies as well as ideas. Access. Millennials, again, this VIP special status. They love to feel like they can get access to something in the moment. So the runways of Milan, that they could then, through an iPad, be able to watch what the new fashions are. And the rise of fast fashion, Zara, H&M, all of these organizations are based on collapsing the amount of time it takes from this special moment where new fashion breaks and is discovered by the millennial sort of consumer, and then the next day that they're able to then wear things that look like the things that they just saw in Milan. And approval. We, in the time that it took for us to first start talking to you to now be on the stage, we've acquired the Thumb mobile platform. This is an environment where, again, kids go to ask and answer each other's questions. And as researchers, we were absolutely fascinated with a couple of things. One, our ability to ask them questions alongside the questions that they're asking. So, if they're asking their friends, should I buy this? Should I wear this? Should I break up with my boyfriend or girlfriend? We hear that a lot. And so basically, alongside those questions, we can ask questions like, would you buy this? Would you try this? Is this something that would be interesting to you? The other more fascinating thing about the Thumb environment is in the 18 months that it's existed, there have been 1.5 billion, with a B, opinions shared. So questions asked and votes or responses given. And mining that is teaching us a lot about what is on the mind of millennials. The questions that they ask each other could be more powerful than the questions that we can ask them. So this is a generation that's constantly attached and addicted to their mobile devices. 98% of 14 to 29-year-olds have a mobile phone, and 6 out of 7 of those are smartphones, not what we would call the feature phone. And basically, they're using this for, 73% of them are using it for 2 hours a day. You look at some of these other stats in terms of how often they're using technology. 44% of them are looking at their phone 6 or more times an hour. We just did a big study for, do you remember what this is? Millennials don't really understand what this is. Because when this can tell you what time it is, what's the point in this? When this can wake you up in the morning, what's the point in an alarm clock? When this can play you music, when these things have the power to do everything, all of a sudden millennials are sort of clearing out the clutter of their lives. There's no need to get an expensive watch. Look at the face of a college graduate when their parents give them a watch. It's hilarious. And there's also this sort of codependency. We saw one of the people in the video, sort of talking about how he's ridiculed by other family members, but 65% saying that they'd be lost without their cell phone, 54% saying it's a lifeline to the world around them. It's an extension of me for 41%. It reflects my personality for 31%. 48% of them say that their phone is the one device that they couldn't live without. Nearly half say, take anything else away from me. Take anything else away. Don't take my cell phone. That's the last thing you need to leave me. So they're constantly looking at them. They're using them for things like social media, for messaging, for games, for music. And again, this sign of the codependence, 29% say that they'd rather lose their wallet than their cell phone. Hey, my wallet, there's stuff in there I can live without, but my cell phone, it'd be tough. And then, this is becoming mobile commerce behavior. 70% of folks 14 to 29 have made a purchase via their smartphone. So very soon, you won't need that wallet because that cell phone is going to take care of all of those things for you. And did I mention texting? This is a real stat, right? That's incredible. Nearly 2,000 texts a month. And if you work with the mobile carriers, they'll tell you that by age, it accelerates. If you want to talk to older millennials about their younger millennial siblings, they'll say, yeah, listen, hey, I like texting, but you should see my little sister. She's insane, right? Off the charts kinds of amplification of behavior. So this technology trend and the mobility trend are actually accelerating right now, where you're going to see more of these types of behavior. Actually, I lied about 2 data points. I said that all of the bad behaviors are at all-time lows with the millennial generation. There are 2 bad behaviors that are actually higher than for Generation X. The first one is prescription drug abuse. This is a recent phenomenon. This is something that, with Ritalin and the over-medication of the millennial generation, sort of sanctioned by the family doctor, but maybe not quite taking the right pathway through the individual, is sort of the new drug as opposed to the old illicit drugs of before that you had to buy on street corners. The other bad behavior that's on the rise, amazingly, is emergency room visits by small children. So the millennials, as parents, are kind of addicted to their smartphones. And so the one thing they are is inattentive when it comes to caring for their own children. And there's been a couple of well-publicized events where, some millennial, whether they be a nanny or a parent, said, well, listen, I just looked at my phone for like 30 seconds, and before I knew it, catastrophe struck. And then when you look at the video camera that was recording the event, it's like 6-7 minutes that they're staring at this phone while the kid clearly is escalating in terms of danger and harm, and they're not paying attention. So digital distraction is this, this rising phenomenon that's fairly negative and fairly millennial in nature. So one of the interesting things is, we have relationships with nearly 2.5 million. I know it pales in comparison to the number of, millennials that you touch on a day-to-day basis. But I wanted to share with you the things that we've been doing to make sure that we are capable of connecting with the millennial generation on their terms and on their time frame. And the first is, every survey that we do is mobile enabled. You guys know the survey business. There's these huge grid questions sometimes where there's 6 columns across and 20 attributes down. Our system breaks those up into individual questions and shows them on a smartphone or an iPad differently than it shows them on a laptop screen. And so basically, it's interesting how you have to sort of think mobile first. Think about, okay, well, how is this going to look on a mobile device? Because chances are they're going to be doing it on a mobile device. A quarter of the kids that take our surveys do it on a phone. And again, if we don't want them to take the survey on a phone, we have to very consciously say, okay, look at what they're using to access this survey, and if it's a phone and we want to show a TV ad and the TV ad needs some screen real estate, we need to sort of push the people to the sidelines who are using smartphones. And again, the acquisition of thumb, this gamified environment where, on a social basis, people are asking and answering each other's questions in a very authentic way. I'll give you a couple of stats from this environment. It blows my mind, really. They spend 4 hours a month asking and answering each other's questions. We couldn't ask 4 hours a month for the survey process in a million years, but in the thumb environment, they'll share their opinions. They'll sit there and it's very quick, lightweight, almost surveytainment, and they'll just sit there and constantly be, thumbs up, I like this, I don't like that. They'll leave comments and a little bit of clarity as to why they feel that way. And this, this ability to then connect with them in real time is what allows us to use Thumb Pro, which is a tool where, and I think I'm going to have time to show you a quick demo of how we can ask a question. And I'll actually ask you to start thinking now about if you could have access to a couple hundred kids in real time and ask them a question about food service or cafeteria or anything else that's on your mind, let's go ahead and ask them that question and see how they respond. So to wrap up, I'd like to say that, the punchline for a Sodexo is the millennials are a very experiential generation. Experiences are everything to them. You know, that's the moment that they live in. Dining is an experience. And feedback moments exist throughout this experience, right? You have little pain points, and in the moment, you can capture a lot of clarity and resolution about what's going on in that moment, and then it fades. So this feedback sort of floats around in the minds of the millennial consumer for a few fleeting moments, and then poof, it's gone. And they're moving on to other things. Again, digital distraction. So there's a residue, but not a real clear sense of, okay, what do we do about this? So they don't respond after the fact so well. They kind of respond more in the moment. If you think about their world, it makes perfect sense. So capturing their feedback, their thoughts, their opinions in high resolution kind of demands that you be in the moment as well. That 25 minutes that it took to, read a tweet from a millennial is just far too long. And we know what rarely works, right? Comment cards don't work. Emails don't work. Our acquisition of Thumb was inspired by McDonald's, who said to us that as they look at their in-store feedback, when they get to the age of 30, it drops like a rock. Millennials will not look at a URL on the back of a cash register receipt. They will not, look at an email from McDonald's based on a loyalty program that they signed up for. That's not the way that they kind of give feedback. And we also know what sort of works, this sort of, hashtags and tweets, the ability to sort of do things in the moment online when digital experiences. And so what we sort of think is the kind of future of feedback for millennials is this in the moment. Sort of think of Foursquare, right? Foursquare was the perfect mental analogy that we had in our minds when we thought, okay, how will millennials give feedback? They'll show up, they'll check in. You might have a moment of opportunity there to sort of say, hey, how are we doing today? Or after they've checked in, you might be able to sort of catch them as they check out again, which is an interesting question to ask. So we're defining Thumb as this peer-to-peer mobile customer feedback mechanism, the customer experience management tool where, feedback's wanted in the moment as they enter, as they decide, as they dine. And so let's go ahead and use Thumb Pro for a second. Hopefully somebody's thought of a question that we can ask in real time of millennials. I've got one. Maybe we'll start with mine, unless somebody's got something just burning right now that they could ask. Oops. Would help if I spelled things right. So my question is, how can technology how about this? Can it use that image. So can technology enhance your experience? Well, let's be grammatically correct. Within your school's cafeteria, if so, how? With a little image of the sort of cafeteria experience. And we can select males and females, males only, females only, and we can have different age categories. Let's not worry so much about 35 plus. Maybe even let's not worry about 25 to 34, but let's go from 13 to 24 and see how they feel about that. And let's go ahead and ask a couple hundred kids. So what'll happen is, now in real time, these kids, again for 4 hours a month, will come in and they're answering questions from each other in real time. Right now is not the best time in terms of time of day. It's pretty early on the West Coast. It's actually mid to late day in the UK. Thumb has kids that are participating from around the world, but about 70% of them are in the US only. And so what they'll be doing is, they're on a bus, they're going between places, They're going in there to ask and answer each other's questions. This question's going to pop up, and they're going to go ahead and answer it. If they leave a comment, right, then we can then ask them a follow-up question. So we'll see how many people leave comments as we go along the way. So we'll hit refresh. We've gotten 33 responses already. So 30% think yes, 70% think no. Is this a science fair project that you haven't done, so you're asking other people to do it for you? So clearly, you know, they're on to me on this one. What should we say to Austin? How about we say, busted? Can you help? So we'll see if Austin has it in him to kind of help us out. We're up to 58 votes now. So let's see, let's see what they're saying.
Can anyone get on this?
Yeah, in fact, so Thumb Pro is a tool that we'd be happy to give you guys trial accounts for. You can actually not worry about using the Pro tool and just use Thumb itself and be able to ask these questions. But in our mind, so think about it. We're market researchers. Our world, and for 22 years of my career, has been based on these verbose 15-minute interactions where I ask a lot of questions of my definition to try to get every last bit of information from them. Now, millennials will play that game if you pay them enough, right? And surveyu.com is our survey environment. We've got 150,000 kids. They know the deal. We'll pay you money. You give us feedback. You tell us what's on your mind. But the questions are going to be our questions, and we're going to ask them our way. 11-point semantic differential scales, card sorts, drag and drop. This is not the millennial experience. This is not how they want to participate. But they'll do it because we pay them $10 an hour. So a 15-minute survey, and we're going to give them $2.50, and they're going to do it our way, and then they're going to move on to doing it their way. Thumb, in our mind, is their way. This is that quick hit, thumbs up, thumbs down, ability to interact with people, and be able to sort of share your opinions. So we can now look at the results details again. We've gone from 68 votes up to 100 votes. So we're halfway home here. We've got a number of replies. Haley in Washington says no. Amanda says nope. She'd be happy if technology could stop aging. Jesse. So then basically, more material means a greater variety and choice of food. It's a quality and variation taste of the food and the amount of choice that there is that really counts. So let's ask Rio, who's in Great Britain, a question, which is, would like it if you could decide tomorrow's menu via a mobile app. So we're going to crowdsource the menu on a day-to-day basis. If anybody's in logistics, I understand. I know that's not something you want to consider or entertain. But if you think about the Chipotle model, they've got a number of different ingredients that then they, take and combine in a number of different ways. So the logistics of it is a little bit less of the concern. But the variety and the menu, this is a generation where, again, experience is everything. And their ability to, in the morning, look at a sort of proposed menu and vote and decide on what's going to be on the lunch menu that day is going to drive a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. First thing they're going to talk about when they get to school with their friends, they've discovered this app, they're going to share this notion of the crowdsourced menu with their friends. Hey, listen, I really like Jell-O. Hey, vote for Jell-O, because I want some Jell-O today. And in a very team orientation, the other kids are going to vote for Jell-O because they know their friend is a Jell-O fiend, right? So you basically have this ability for them to take and leverage a lot of those core contextual elements of this generation for good and for behavior. Let's look at how we're doing on Thumb. And has anybody thought of any other questions that they like to ask? No, Austin's gotten back to us. Yeah, it can help. Just ask to put a timer and count lunch one day on laptops instead of hard copy. Then time how long it takes to say 10 students. Huh. Count lunch. I'm not sure. Does anybody understand what he's saying? Is he trying to get people to do the line faster? Oh, maybe. A count timer. Oh, okay, great. So he's talking operational efficiencies. How about a crowdsourced ability to decide tomorrow's menu. So we'll ask that. You know what? In SurveyU, they do it for money. In Thumb, they do it for stars. I'm not kidding you. It's ridiculous in my mind. So what do stars give you, right? Stars, for 500 stars a month, it unlocks the ability for them within this environment to check out the people that they're interacting with, check out their profile, like who they are and where and they will kill each other for 500 stars. In fact, thanks for reminding me, because of all the people that have commented, if I don't give them their stars, they are going to be so upset with me, right? They are not going to, they're not going to be happy. So we've given them their stars. And maybe what we could do is, by using it, they're sarcastic a lot. We'll ask Alberto, how might technology be used to make cafeteria? Oops. You can only just get the one star. But trust me, he now that we've given him a star, he's in our pocket. We can count on him. Okay, well listen, and that really is the conclusion of what I wanted to sort of help you guys understand today, but I'm sure you have some questions.